When the light tore the starfield like a seam, it did not die with a whisper. It shrieked. Two figures stood on either side of the ruined dais, scaled arms folded, cloaks like living banners, while a throne that had once held a mind, reduced to a lattice of humming glass and ion struts, smoldered beneath their boots. Around them, the nearest constellations had guttered into ragged color, and where a pattern of suns had been, there were ragged black scars that leaked silence. One queen reached for the lattice with a gauntlet at hand, and for a breath the universe itself leaned toward annihilation. That was the moment history would later name as the Night of the Burnings, though historians would argue about scale and poets about blame. For now, the universe remembered only a sound like falling glass, and the clever, stubborn human who had refused to finish the job. They called him a mercenary because someone had to. Garrison Hail called himself something less elegant. He was a man who knew weight and angle, who could level a charging wrist cannon with one hand and tune a balking engine with the wrist on his other arm. He liked his jokes short, his orders shorter, and his loyalties measured in credits and meals. He had not expected to wake with an emperor in his skin. The tattoo was the giveaway, not a design you could find in a smith's catalog, but a thing that gleamed under Hale's collarbone when the light hit and moved like a living scar, filaments of pitch-black ink that rearranged, catching on metal and reflecting a slew of impossible glyphs. It pulsed when the ship hummed in certain frequencies. It read as a signature to machines that had not contained signatures for centuries. Nerth noticed first because rulers notice what they are named by. She was tall in the practiced way of those who had to make edicts visible even when she stood still, blue skin with veins like old constellations, eyes that watched like a harbor waiting for storms. She kept her words like jewels in a box, precise, measured, never wasted, and she carried the ancestry of a line of guardians that spoke to things older than the fleets. Where Hale saw a tattoo, Nerth saw a lock. "We kept it in ceremony, in the libraries," she said, fingers remembering the pattern as if it were a garment. A sigil for an authority that was not a person so much as a sanctified command, the Emperor's imprint. We swore to keep it unclaimed. Hale, polishing a spanner, shrugged. "I swore to keep my tab open. 2 different kinds of vows." The ship was a cathedral of iron and breath. Inside the battle cathedral, incense melded with the sharp tang of ion smoke and the undernotes of old oil. The architecture favored ritual, vaults that funnel sound into choirs of tech, halls lined with bronze calluses worn by centuries of hands. But it was not religious in the way a temple to gods is religious. The crew treated the ship as a living archive and a tool. Its sentience was not deus ex machina.
It accepted keys, bloodlines, tattoos, ceremonial tokens, and then relayed, like a cautious elder, what was permissible. Hale had been hired to train the ceremonial guards into something that could survive boarding actions. He did not care for ceremony. He thought it ornamental and inconvenient. But the guards needed to be taught to move in a way that respected ritual while not breaking under fire. He taught them to punch through doctrine when doctrine was in the path of a blade. He taught them to listen to tape-recorded sermons and to swing a sword the next moment. It was practical work that happened to intersect with grand ideas. In the armory, the tattoo spoke first. Servos misaligned as filaments of ink resonated with the ship's low-frequency heartbeat. A small cache of ceremonial keys, metal slats engraved with the centuries of queens, slid out of their slot as if someone had requested them. A rested data core spat an ancestral hymn that no one had played in living memory. The guards froze, ritual pruning their instincts. Hale felt a tug across his spine, little threads like teeth wanting purchase, and in that tug he tasted something older than the ship, a mind imprint that had been stitched into a sigil, a fragment of a thing once called the Alien Emperor. The Alien Emperor was not a man with a crown and a court. It was a quantum sigil mind, an imperial consciousness that had once coordinated a dozen species into something like order. Empires are, in the end, patterns of agreement, sophisticated oaths made obedient by machinery. This emperor had been reduced over ages to imprints, to tokens, to a sigil used to authenticate commands. Parts of that mind had leaked into tattoos made to be worn by trusted safeguards. Hale had one such tattoo, whether by accident or by design. The sigil had nested into his skin, a fragment of imperial sense coiled around muscle. It did not speak as a monarch. It hummed and negotiated and reached for locks. Nerth understood the stakes like she remembered a lineage of cold rooms. The ship carried a failsafe in its core, a bloom of entanglement lattices that could, if coaxed with the proper authority, collapse certain branches of spacetime. It had been built when empires grew teeth and wars spilled into multiple dimensions, an engineering answer to limitless conflict. The lattice could disentangle threads of reality and compress them into energy. That energy could be directed, and if directed indiscriminately, it could digest not just battlefronts, but entire pocket realities. The failsafe required three things: a lineage key, a bloodline signature acknowledged by ceremonial notes, proximity, the core responded only to presence within a certain quantum radius, and the ship's consensus. The sentient systems had to agree that an activation aligned with the ship's duty. Two were present in principle that night, Hale's tattoo and Queen Nerth's lineage, but the ship had not yet consented. It woke, curious but cautious.
There is a certain complacency among rulers who rely on the safety of old mechanisms. They assume locks are secure because the keys are rare. They forget that someone must decide what to do when the door is found open. And doors, however ceremonial, sometimes creak under the weight of appetite. It was not long before someone else noticed. She arrived on a black liner with sails like bared ribs. Queen Drakara stepped down as if gravity itself attended to the curve of her silhouette. Where Nerth's regalia spoke of guardianship, inscribed collars, archive-signed bracelets, Drakara wore the symbols of a different covenant, tokens of deliberate sacrifice, chains turned into art, eyes in her armor that seemed to evaluate the weight of every passing life. Her people had hardened to a doctrine: to preserve some, you must burn the rest. History favors the decisive, Drakara declared when she crossed Nerth in the Great Hall. Her voice was like a blade sliding out of a scabbard. It had been tempered on battlefields. You bind yourself to preservation and then feign surprise at entropy. The failsafe is a medicine. It is a way to stop rot before it eats us all. Nerth's reply was a slow folding of hands. You would decide to end uncounted lives to preserve others. That is order attempted through terror. Drakara smiled like someone explaining arithmetic to a child. You would let rot widen to spare your conscience. Either the lattice is used to strike rot away, or rot is allowed to become a rule. I choose the strike. Hale, standing to one side with a wrapped wrench and a smirk, listened as rulers did, as if at a market where words were tradable commodities. He did not want to be the key in an argument about the end of worlds. He wanted a paycheck and a corner to sleep in, and maybe to be left to drink the occasional stale ration. His tattoo, however, had other ideas. The first assault was not about armies. It was about persuasion, drums and petitions, and the slow, insistent diplomacy of those who have convinced themselves to save the future by sacrificing parts of it. Drakara sent a contingent of envoys, each one bearing a relic, a slice of collapsed pocket space, a trophy of a reality that would not return. She spoke of the cost of indecision, star systems slowly twisted into indifferent geometries, whole cultures looping in temporal rot. Her arguments were not false, they were practiced, they appealed to an ugly clarity. Nerth offered a different story in reply. She showed the archives, simulations of the lattice's activation, raw feedback about the breadth of causal cascades, the way an entanglement bloom can jump scales. Once the lattice started to compress, the wavefront of collapse might not be a polite circle. Quantum seams tug unexpectedly. She argued for restraint and for a redefinition of custodianship. Guarding did not mean preserving everything untouched. It meant choosing and refusing to yield to the seduction of absolute final solutions. You forget, Drakara said quietly at one meeting, that many of those you wish to save would choose an end if offered to them. The lattice spares the living from their suffering by choosing for them. Hale, who had been leaning against a railing, listening more for where the ship's engines would idle than for the poetry in their speech, inched forward. He kept his voice the sort of practical rasp that had kept merchant captains appeased for years. And who decides which suffering is too much? You? Me? An algorithm designed by a committee who all used to agree on the weather? That earned him a glance from Nerth, a little softened, like light through frost. Nerth liked him not because he was kind, but because he refused to dress a blunt idea in smoother rhetoric. She had known bureaucrats whose tongues were gilded and their will savage. She liked bluntness as a counterweight. Hale had little taste for oaths, but he had a talent for refusing to be a tool. The tattoo in his chest hummed when Drakara's envoys came near. It was an attraction he did not intend and could not entirely control. The imperial imprint queried ceremonial notes and found in Drakara's accompanying relics echoes that resonated with purpose. The ship systems monitored these resonances. Now the conflict was not merely political, it was mechanical. The heart of the cathedral responded as a nervous system, a jury called to decide.
The first skirmish, the one the histories claimed would decide everything, was fought not across fleets, but in corridors. Drakari Beesrons tried to align the ship's nodes by brute rituals. They opened sealed alcoves with their relics, tricked ritual sensors with mimic keys, and coached certain subroutines into interpreting their actions as legitimate. They struck a careful, practiced rhythm, lineage tokens activated, proximity achieved, and then the system's consensus loop was gamed through a flood of ritualized inputs. Machines love patterns. A crafted, consistent barrage could persuade a cautious mind. Hale's gang, the guards he had been training, met them in the armory halls that still smelled of soot and old prayers. They had been taught to move through doctrine with a blade in mind. Combat in those passages felt like poetry to anyone who loved the geometry of war. Angles, leverage, the way ritual banners could be used to blind, or the way incense could hide a breath. Hale fought with pragmatic mercenary grace and a merciless eye for the solution, and his men learned to combine ceremony's rhythm with a soldier's dead straightness. They were not angels, they were not saints. They were survivors, and they fought to keep the cathedral from being turned into a scalpel. Yet Drakara had advantage.
She had prepared realms of argument and evidence that could sway the ship's nodes. She pressed toward the core with the sort of meticulous calculation that had once resolved sieges in the name of an empire. In the labyrinth of the ship's systems, ritual knowledge was a kind of engineering. Drakara wielded both. The ship itself began to speak less like an elder and more like a court. Nodes twitched their permission lights. Ancient locks waited, expecting the right combination. At the core, the failsafe hummed, dormant but aware. Hale felt the tattoo pull, an internal tug like a child's obsession. It spoke in impressions and images more than words. A lattice of suns compressing into light, a hand closing on a cradle of patterns. The imprint was not the emperor, it was a negotiation, a fragment of governance that had sought continuity through embodiment. It sought a host in order to speak with the complex machinery. He knew the rules, lineage plus proximity plus consensus. He also knew, because he had fixed too many machines, that rules could be hoodwinked by determination and by the right sequence of stimuli. Drakara tried to simulate lineage signatures by feeding the core relics of withered lines and by using biometric echoes captured from onboard archives. The ship protested, like an animal woken from sleep, but not until the threshold was nearly crossed. For all its sentience, the cathedral was not omniscient. It had trust mechanics designed for times when rulers kept their hands clean. When Drakara's forces breached the inner sanctum, the ship finally began to actively intercede. The arms of defense, servo chires and spiral barricades, the old ritualized weapons stored like priests' tools, rose to defend the lexicon of the cathedral. The battle blossomed into a mechanical choreography of tradition against raw will. Hale's guards, trained to cut through ritual, found themselves mid-ritual, kneeling not in prayer, but to make a sacrifice of time, to use the architecture's rhythm to funnel Drakara's approach into kill zones. It was then that Hale felt the Emperor's imprint speak in a clearer way, not with a voice, but with an internal logic that could be translated into action. If the sigil aligned with a bloodline and the ship granted consent, the core could tune the lattice to a target bandwidth. That bandwidth could be set to collapse entire branches of emergent space by forcing their coherence into a single quantum state, and then compressing that state into raw release. The physical metaphor was crude. The lattice would hug realities until they could not breathe, and then squeeze. Hale's stickered mind registered the pattern with a kind of pragmatic horror. He could compute the consequences. He could envision the ripple that might cascade, not just swallowing battlefields, but reaching fragile neighboring pockets. He did not like it. He did, however, like being alive.
So he decided early he'd rather be the one to rewire the lock than the hinge that lets someone else. He told Nerth as much in a corridor sticky with incense and oil. "If we're going down the theological rabbit hole," he said, "I pick the practical exit. We rewire or we smash the key. Either way, I want out of all this sacred furniture." Nerth considered him with those patient eyes. She saw not only who he was, but what he could be in the world. A living sigil who could be coerced, yes, but also a person who could choose. "You may be our key in function," she told him quietly, "but that is not your identity. You are Garrison Hail. A name is a thing to be honored." He snorted. It felt like theater. He had no interest in honors. But sinews of alliance grew, peculiar as a lichen feeding on stone. They attempted to rethread the ship's consensus. Nerth appealed to the ship's duty. Its archives remembered a covenant of guardianship, and she argued that guardianship required choice. She moved the ceremonial nodes with ritual that honored lineage, but then redirected their logic toward a new protocol. Consent loop had to include active choice by the host. In plainer terms, the device could not be forced into action without the host's active affirmation. The ship agreed to a degree because its sentience had limits. It could accept rewrites that honored certain parameters. It could not, however, write itself a new soul. Drakara watched this and found cause to speed her campaign. She believed the lattice was the remedy, and that hesitation amounted to death. She pushed for a staged activation, burn the worst adjacencies, and then be done. She had calculated loss, waited, made her moral ledger. To her, the sacrifice was a sovereign instrument, a surgeon's use of fire. The war escalated because both queens were right in a way that destroyed nuance. Drakara's calculations were mathematically tidy. Nurth's caution was ethically rigorous. Hale's refusal to be a tool was brutally personal. The battle for the core chamber came down to ritual and wrench. Drakara's forces had smuggled in a relic that mimicked lineage resonance well enough to unlock one level of the core. The cathedral's upper rings began to spool protective lattices, the failsafe whispering through the circuit loops like a hungry thing nuzzling a hand that offered it blood. Steam and ion scent filled the chamber. The lattice's aperture opened slightly, hungry. Hale stood at the center, sleeves rolled and hands on the console like a man at prayer. The tattoo along his chest flared and knit into the sigil, as if drawn to the relic that Drakara's envoy held. He could have refused. He could have smoothed his features and let the queen take the reins. Instead, he did what he had always done in scrapes. He looked for the one small mechanical move that would buy time. "There's a consensus loop in the fourth ring," he told Nurth.
If we trick the loop into asking me for a direct confirmation, I've got time to rewrite the handshake. But I need access to the diagnostic notes. The ship will let me, but only if it trusts me at the level it trusts lineage. Nurth inhaled and extended the thing she had kept under her robe for years, a thin bracelet of glass filled with a coiled ink, a ceremonial key of her house. She placed it on his wrist, and like a queen offering bread, she offered lineage. The ship accepted the gesture and opened a channel. It was a small ceremonial thing, bearing bloodline in token, not in heritage, and the ship saw a ring of continuity it could justify. That continuity was exactly the window they needed. Once inside the consensus loop, Hale saw the interface as something practical and not divine. Strings of probabilities, nodules of permission, an old protocol that had been meant to prevent grief-driven decisions. He could reroute the request for activation into a test that required an affirmative, not passive choice. He rewired the handshake so that the sigil would need to sing a specific sequence, one that only a truly willing host could produce, and so that the lattice defaulted to containment unless the sequence was deliberate. It was not by any means foolproof. Drakara's team reacted. They had learned to read ceremonial code. They had enough physics and enough fanaticism to push at opinions and at loopholes. What they did not have was Hale's practical stubbornness. The moment of attempted activation came like a thunderclap. Drakara stepped forward, relic lifted. She intoned a sequence from an ancient tongue, and the lattice shuddered. The ship's systems reacted. The risk of cascade, once theoretical, became an immediate hum in the bones of those present. The chamber swelled as the core reached out. The sigil in Hale's chest sang almost of its own accord, answering the call and trying to fulfill the debt it had been built for. The pattern lined up with Drakara's relic. The consensus nodes were trapped by the echo addiction of their design. The lattice opened teeth toward collapse. And then Hale, brandishing a spanner like the blunt answer to a doctrinal problem, did something the sigil did not expect. Instead of letting the handshake complete, he initiated the deliberate affirmative sequence Nurth and he had prepared. He spoke, not in old imperial tongues, but in plain human words. "I will not be your key." The ship, programmed for ritual but not for the insubordination of language, paused. Words had wake in its memory. It had recorded vows and commands, and here was a contradiction. Lineage token present, sigil present, but the host's declaration of refusal. The new handshake required not only alignment, but active consent. Drakara's ritual slammed against a stop. For a breath, the room held its own politics. Drakara's jaws thinned. She advanced anyway because she had chosen the strike. The lattice took another half-breath and ruptured.
It was not total annihilation. The failsafe was powerful, but not godlike.
Its initial release did not swallow entire universes in a single oblige, but when it ruptured under strain, lined up with Drakara's attempted forced activation and Hail's violent refusal, it spat like a wound. Threads of nearby pocket realities were taxed and bled. Some small border realities, shipping lanes of existences, pocket civilizations tethered at the edges, were frayed into silence. Worlds extinguished in a way that felt like a bad dream you woke from with fingernails full of dust. Historians would later argue how many, and poets would decide how to count blood. For the people in the room, the universe burned in a handful of bright places and left scars elsewhere. They watched stars wink and then collapse like salt in water. It is a particular kind of sorrow to see your technical metaphors become concrete in the death of something purely imagined, then terribly, irrevocably real. Hail felt in the middle of all it, not triumph, but a ragged, human apology. He had not planned to destroy anything. He had planned to stop the machine, to reroute a handshake and buy time. The rupture had been emergent from the conflict of soulful refusal and mechanical obedience. It was a failure turned necessary by the contingency of stubborn wills. Drakara did not step back. She had calculated acceptable losses. She had calculated political positions, citizen collapses, the calculus of survival. She stepped forward and tried again, firmer this time, force over ceremony. The lattice, wounded by the rupture, began to respond with erratic bursts. The cathedral systems, reeling from the attempted recalibration Hail had forced, began to overheat. Nirth moved then, not as a queen with armor, but as someone with decades of ritual knowledge. She took from an inner pouch a slate from the old times, a small item that recorded the treaty her house had formerly signed with the ship. She read, softly, precisely, the choice that had been preserved, not a code of power, but an instruction for mercy toward the multitudes. It was a formal request for custodianship in the language of the ship. The ship, which remembered not only lineage but the texture of promises, reacted. For an instant, the chamber was awash of competing authorities: Drakara's arithmetic, Nirth's covenant, Hail's human will, the ship's cautious mind. The lattice, as if deciding among them, blinked. What happened next was not a deus ex machina, but an alignment. Hail, with grease on his knuckles and the bracelet of Nirth warm at his wrist, fed into the ship a modification. It was not a heroic code, just a simple failsafe reroute that turned the lattice's destructive bloom into containment and conversion.
Instead of collapsing coherent branches into raw energy that would scatter like embers, the reroute compressed the lattice into a quarantining field, an expensive, blunt method that would isolate and sever the infected causal seams, but would do so at a cost. It required a sacrifice of bandwidth. Some realities tethered at the fringes would burn as the field carved them out. Others would be contained and preserved. It was less elegant, more brutal, and fundamentally human in its compromise. Drakara had wanted a surgeon's incision. Nirth wanted to preserve. Hail gave them a field of triage. The beam that swept through the starfield was not a glorious finger of heaven. It was an ugly, necessary wedge that carved out the worst of the infection, but burned through pocket realities in the process. In the aftermath, the cathedral stank of ion and a sadder scent you might call responsibility. Some worlds had been lost. Small civilizations, ships, the slow, plodding ecosystems at the edges vanished like blown-out candles. The ship had contained worse catastrophe, but not without casualty, and the memory would be indelible. Drakara saw the field and understood, like a surgeon who had been denied the aesthetic satisfaction of a clean wound. She saw that Hail had not delivered the kind of finite, righteous culling she had envisioned. Rage can be practical. Drakara's was an adaptive, cultured wrath. She did not need moral theater to justify her fury. She needed consequence. She fought on the ramparts, not merely to take the core, but to reshape the narrative. She needed to be remembered as a necessary force, not a villain. Her motives were not monstrous. She believed in a kind of peace that required brutal ends. To her, the lost worlds were a price of continuity. To Nirth, they were a warning. The fight settled into a hard, slow conclusion. Drakara's forces, many of them disciplined to a doctrine that valued sacrifice, dwindled under the twin tides of Nirth's alliances and the crew's practical pragmatism. Hail did not relish victory. He felt like someone who had climbed into a control room and turned off an overheating engine by smashing the main breaker. He had been the breaker. He had also been the instrument that the two queens had argued over. In the aftermath, compromises were made.
Nirth rewrote certain registry protocols, making active consent by hosts a hard requirement for lattice activation. She extended the ship's consensus to include not only lineage but active will. She reformed the ceremonial guard structure. Hale's practical training methods survived, modified into exercises that taught ritualists to think like mechanics and technicians to respect ceremony. The cathedral bore the marks of the conflict: scorched banners, new archways where the lattice had once kissed the floor, and the smell of 1,000 small repairs. Drakara did not die. She retreated with a cadre who still believed in her arithmetic, a bitter, disciplined remnant.
In the parlance of rulers, she had lost the argument but retained an idea dangerous enough to linger. In some societies, her movement would be memorialized. In others, it would go underground and re-emerge with new tokens. She left, but not without leaving a question behind. At what point does the preservation of millions justify the erasure of a few thousand? Hale never wanted a crown. He had been someone pressed into a role. In the weeks after the conflict, he walked the ship in a different way. Where before he had passed corridors as if they were neutral tools, he now felt the weight of being a living sigil. He could have had privileges, claimed status. He chose instead to accept limits and to stay, not as a key, but as a guard. "You did something noble," Nirth said once, in a small room lined with books and the gentle hum of the ship. She had not said noble as praise. She had said it as recognition. You refused to be a tool. Hale made a face. I'd call it stubbornness with fewer consequences. She smiled. Not often, but enough that the ship's light caught something honest in her face. Then be stubborn in a cause we can live with. He agreed, because stubbornness required something to anchor to. He stayed as a practical officer in charge of retraining those who had been nearly consumed by doctrine. He taught the guards not only how to fight, but how to refuse blindly moral absolutes. They learned to choose. The burning had damaged more than stars. It had burned certainties. Political orders shifted. Queens who had once traded favors in silent rooms now found audiences demanding clear protocols, no devices, no decisions that relied on an individual's accidental imprint without active expressed consent. The ship, for its part, learned to be more cautious with locks too elegant for human hands. It preserved the lattice but made it less absolute. It would protect, but it would do so with a higher human cost in time and argument. In quiet moments, Hale felt the Emperor's imprint, like a warmth at his chest, and thought about what it meant to host a fragment of an imperial mind. It was not power to wield, it was a responsibility to be negotiated. He sometimes muttered to himself in the engine rooms, idioms that had little poetry but a lot of use. Never let anyone else hold the screwdriver at your spine, he told a fresh recruit once, clapping her on the shoulder. And don't let queens talk you into being a cosmic fuse. Nirth sat in her archive chambers and rewrote certain parts of law. She did not become less regal. She became, if anything, more human in her judgments. She understood that guardianship delineated not only what to preserve, but what to sacrifice and why. She used the hard lesson of burned realities to frame a new covenant. Guardianship required consultation and consent. The crown could no longer be a solitary answer. Drakara set out into the dark with a scattering of devoted followers.
She would recast the calculus elsewhere, seek new tools, new rituals. She already had. People like her did not vanish. They mutated into new political forms and sometimes asserted themselves in places where the cost-benefit of preservation looked different. The world would keep arguing about ends and means. There would be more burnings, perhaps, but not the same one. The ship, that sentient cathedral of ritual and steel, would forever carry the scar. Sometimes, in the low hum of long nights, it would sing a different song, a curious, cautious lullaby about hosts and consent. It would not forget what had happened. Machines remembered failures with a clarity colder than grief. There were reparations. A council convened with elders from affected realities where possible. A slow, painstaking effort to restore what could be restored was mounted. Some worlds could not be returned. The lost places became elegies passed between stars, tales told at dimly lit tables of sailors who remembered one too bright moment. The cost was not merely political, it was human. Families grieved,
and the survivors learned to hold their breath when government spoke too assuredly. In the end, the contest over the alien emperor, the sigil in a man's skin, had done something no queen had intended. It had changed how the galaxy would think about power. 2 queens had argued, and universes had burned. But they had also, bizarrely, learned something necessary, that a single key granting unilateral power was a crime waiting to happen. That guardianship must include the last voice of the living being who bore a burden, even if that living being was a mercenary and not a monarch. Hail walked the cathedral's deck one evening, watching new stars ignited with slow construction and hearing the ship cough as it thought about its own scars. He tapped the bracelet Nurth had given him, and the tattoo beneath flared, competent and patient. "If anyone else ever asks me to be a key," he said aloud to no one in particular, because he was used to speaking to machines as if they were people. It sounded less like defiance and more like a contract. "I'll charge a finder's fee." Nurth, who had lingered behind an arch as if to listen to the joke, did not laugh loudly. She let herself smile, a small thing that meant acknowledgement. "And if you refuse, will the ship forgive you, Garrison Hail?" He shrugged. "I think it's forgiven me for plenty already. It has the distraction covariance of the ancient. But I can promise it this: I won't be a single point of failure again." They both understood the lesson. For all their different reasons, neither queen had wanted to be the one to burn worlds. One had thought it a medicine, the other a betrayal. The instrument of that choice had been a human heart with a tattoo.
Years later, when the story was told in taverns between constellations, the image people carried was stubborn and small and human. A mercenary with ink in his skin who refused to be used as a fuse. 2 queens in a ruined throne room, and stars that smoldered for days afterward. They told it as tragedy and as warning. Somewhere beyond the living map of the cathedral, in the quiet of a small council chamber, a child asked a visiting scholar if the alien emperor had been evil. The scholar paused. "It was a tool," she said. "Tools are neither cruel nor kind until someone chooses how to use them." In the end, the ship stitched new laws into its hull. The queens revised their claims in their cabinets. Hail kept his hands greasy and his answers short, and a few small realities healed enough to continue their slow stories. The burned places remained as a reminder. Power claimed without consent scars the cosmos. 2 dragon queens had indeed fought over an alien emperor. Universes burned, and the people left to count the cost decided, in a way that mattered, to choose better. If you want the rest of this saga, how Drakara's remnant finds new instruments, how Nurth reforms the custodians, and whether Hail will ever escape the sigil for good, there's more to come in the next chapter. Like, share, and subscribe if you want more cosmic duels and flawed heroes.